Yes. All right. Excellent. I was about ready to join or whatever, and then when I clicked go live, it didn't work. So, but for those of you who are watching not live, doesn't matter to you at all. So, anyways, welcome. It's fantastic that you're with us. Thank you to Peyton and Jaden for showing up yesterday to Virtual Youth Group VYG. Maybe Jonathan will make an appearance next week, and maybe his appearance would cause more people to show up. I don't know. On that front, I'm going to talk a little faster today because I'm going to try to get through this quickly because I got some things that I need to go do. Specifically, I need to go kind of create a welcome for Steve and Sarah. They're bringing home their baby today, and so I have this brilliant idea of chalking out on their driveway "Welcome Home" in like really huge letters and whatnot. So hopefully that goes well. Anyways, so I got to go do that right like as soon as this is done. It's another reason why I'm here at the apartment instead of at the church. In fact, Steve just sent me a text. He says we're 5 hours away. So I do have plenty of time, but I'm still going to take care of that as soon as possible. Anyways, so today, well, real quick, another announcement is we are having church on Sunday. It is a limited number of people, 8 o'clock, 10 o'clock. If you are wanting to come to a live church service instead of just online, come at 8 o'clock or come at 10 o'clock. They'll basically be the same, but choose which one you want to come to. Anyways, with that, let's get into the Devos. Again, we are talking about how we are empowered by the Holy Spirit to be Christ's witnesses throughout the planet. And one of the things that we're doing is we first looked at what that looks like by the fruit of the Spirit, but then also now we are looking at the men in Acts and women in Acts who were empowered by the Holy Spirit and how they were empowered. So today we come to Acts chapter 6, the end of chapter 6, or the second half of it, where Stephen begins his long dissertation. We are going to look at tomorrow's chapter 7, and we're going to look at that tomorrow. Because I think this is more of a two-part kind of talk. But just looking at Acts chapter 6, we'll read through the verses because it's 8 through 15, 7 verses. It says, "Now Stephen, a man full of grace and power, performed great wonders and signs among the people." Remember Stephen in the previous verses. If you scroll up or look up, he is now a deacon or a servant that serves the widows of the church. And he's doing miracles, basically, wonders and signs among the people. Verse 9, "Opposition arose, however, from members of the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, Jews of Cyrene and Alexandria, as well as the provinces of Cilicia and Asia, who began to argue with Stephen. But they could not stand up against the wisdom the Spirit gave him as he spoke. Then they secretly persuaded some men to say, 'We have heard Stephen speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God.' So they stirred up the people and elders and the teachers of the law. They seized Stephen and brought him before the Sanhedrin. They produced false witnesses who testified, 'This fellow never stopped speaking against this holy place and against the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses handed down to us.' Then in verse 15, all who were sitting in the Sanhedrin looked intently at Stephen, and they saw that his face was like the face of an angel." So, number one, Stephen is a normal guy. This is a perfect example of an individual like you and I who can be empowered by the Holy Spirit to do amazing things. And in verse 7 or 8 there, it talks about how he was doing signs and wonders and preaching boldly. And obviously he had some opposition and they were debating with him and whatnot. But it was the Holy Spirit that was empowering him. He wasn't an apostle. Okay? He wasn't one of the original 12. He wasn't one of the individuals that Jesus taught directly. Probably he could have been, but probably not. And he isn't one of those special guys. He's just a regular guy that is filled with the Holy Spirit, empowered by the Holy Spirit to be Christ's witness to the world. And at that moment, it was to the regular folks in Jerusalem and to the Sanhedrin, to the leaders and these special teachers of the law named the freedmen from other parts of the world. And just on a side note, we're going to be introduced to the Apostle Paul in the next chapter as, I think, one of these individuals, one of these freedmen individuals. And they're new to town. They didn't know who this Jesus was. They weren't around for his crucifixion. And now they're just seeing his disciples preaching and teaching with power from the Holy Spirit, and they don't like it. And just like the other Pharisees and Sanhedrin members, they question them, just like they question Jesus. They try to trip him up. And yet, it tells us very simply that they're unable to do that because his wisdom is not for his own, it's coming from the Holy Spirit. And so, couple things here for us, practically speaking. Number one of the things that keeps us from maybe being a witness or sharing the gospel with people is that we're afraid that people are just going to shoot us down or make us look dumb or whatever. And the reality is, yeah, they're going to try to do that. Some people will. And even if you're smarter than them or have a better argument than them or whatever, they're going to make stuff up just like these people did. They're just going to figure out a way to make you look dumb. You have to just accept that. You have to say, you know what, I'm going into this with the truth. I'm going to share the gospel with them. And hopefully, not hopefully, but I expect the Holy Spirit to step up and share with me or give me the words to say in that moment. And it's not about making them look dumb, because ultimately you go, why am I even doing this? Because in the previous chapter, it talks about, or in the previous section, it talks about how even priests were getting saved. People were getting saved from the testimony and the teachings of the apostles and the Stephen guy. And that's why you do it. You don't do it to win arguments with idiots who are will never listen to you, never change their mind, and only make stuff up about you when they lose the argument. You do it so that the person behind them, who is listening intently and is honest about who is this guy and what's he got to say, they're going to hear it. The Holy Spirit will speak to them through you, and then they will get saved. That's why you do it. That's why you become a Stephen or whatever and step up in your faith and share the gospel, because there are people who are going to get saved. Yes, you're going to have moments where people are opposing you, so to speak, and they may never listen to you. They may make stuff up even when you are smarter. But that's the other thing. The Holy Spirit is the one doing the work. He's empowering Stephen. You and I mean, I'm not saying that you don't prepare at all. Don't read the Bible. I mean, you should read the Bible. You should study. You should try to understand what you're talking about. But ultimately, we're told that we need to go and be Christ's witness, and that we let the Holy Spirit do the talking. Now, obviously, the apostles and Stephen had some learning, some training through Jesus, but most importantly, they had the Holy Spirit to speak through them. And I'll just say, even say things that you wouldn't think make sense, but to that person, God knows what's going on in their hearts and that mind right now. And the words that you're saying may make no sense to you, but make perfect sense to them. Kind of like a moment where, like, I'm going to, throw something out there. Like, if you want to know that God's real, you ask him to prove it, and then go and live your day. And then hopefully the Lord will do that thing that will prove that he's real and wanting you to be part of his family. And maybe it's something that you say to him or her, like they think, like, I need somebody to come up and tell me that they love me today. And you do that. And then that's evidence to them that God is working and that God is there. Kind of like, and that's a very simplistic example, but I hope you get my meaning, that God can use whatever it is that you're saying. The power of the Holy Spirit gives you the words to say, if you, in reality, to make a difference in people's lives. There are people who are never going to listen, and then there's people behind those people who are listening, and that's who the Holy Spirit's talking to. And that's what Stephen's doing here. Okay, so anyways, he's preaching. And like I said, the people from Cyrene, these freedmen individuals, I think potentially are, where Paul's coming from. And then it says that they persuade some men to say, we have heard Stephen speak blasphemous words. So they go out to get people to lie about him. And the blasphemy is against Moses and against God. And this fellow never stops speaking against this holy place. This is the reason he speaks against the holy place, the temple, and against the law, because they've heard him say that Jesus will destroy the temple and change the customs of Moses. Now, just really quickly here, blasphemy against God is a thing. Yes, the holy God, you speak against him, that's called blasphemy. Moses is a man. You can't really speak blasphemy against a man. Now, can you speak against God's people? Sure, and God can get upset about that. But Moses still had problems. Moses still was a man with made mistakes. So it kind of shows their hand that these Jews are, in a sense, worshiping Moses more than they're worshiping God. And they might not have admitted that at the moment, but when you could be killed, one of the things that, blasphemy, which is a death, capital offense against a human being, yeah, I think you're saying that there's something about Moses that's infallible, which Moses is definitely a fallible human being that lived thousands of years ago. Respectable man. I would hope to have been his friend if he was around and I was around then, but not God, not worthy of worship. So, but they boil it down that clearly he's saying something about destroying the temple because he said that Jesus would destroy the temple and that would change the customs of Moses. Now, obviously, we're not sure. Maybe the next chapter tomorrow will indicate a little bit more about what Stephen has been teaching and why they're making up those lies about him. I mean, Jesus did say, I would destroy this temple and build it in 3 days, but he wasn't talking about the actual temple. He was talking about his body. He was talking about how he was going to be killed and then it would come back to life in 3 days. Obviously, we don't believe as Christians that the temple, that, by the way, doesn't exist in Israel right now, is no longer the holy place on earth. That Stephen, at that moment was the temple because the Holy Spirit was indwelling Stephen or the other Christians. You and I are the temple of the Lord. And a lot of times as Christians, we kind of forget about that or whatever. I mean, we tend to think like the church building is a holy place. It's not. Church buildings become holy when holy people who are the actual temples of the Lord enter into it. And then they're all sitting there worshiping the Lord. Then it becomes a holy place. But that's only because the temples, meaning you and I who are indwelt by the Holy Spirit, are there. But regardless, we already know from this passage that they were lying about him. So Stephen may not even have been even saying any of those things. But just trying to understand it a little bit, that might be where he's coming from. Anyways, the last thing that I want to mention here is verse 15 says, all who were sitting in the Sanhedrin looked intently at Stephen, and they saw that his face was like the face of an angel. Now, if you go to the New Living Translation, because the question is, what does that mean? Verse 15 is a special verse. His face began to look like a face of an angel. What does that mean? The New Living Translation translates it as his face became bright like an angel's face. That there was something irradiating light out of his face, possibly. Maybe all angels look like a certain way, and all of a sudden his face distorted into that angel thing, or he was literally beaming light. Now, why is he doing that? I'm not 100% sure. Okay, it could be the Holy Spirit really coming out in him right at that moment in an amazing way. The physical aspect of what that was, if his face was just bright or something else changed about it, I don't know, and that's not the important part. The important part is, I think, in verse 15 of chapter 6 is a simple indicator to us that what Stephen is doing at this moment in front of the Sanhedrin is different than any other time. That what he's about to say, tomorrow we'll look at in chapter 7, his testimony, and what is about to happen is one of the most important moments in Jewish history, especially looking back at it. Stephen is standing before the leadership of Israel, just as Peter and the other apostles had done before, but there was something different about this moment. Stephen is standing before the leadership of Israel, and he is about to give the most amazing account of who Jesus is and the history of the Bible and how it all points to the Messiah and that Jesus is that Messiah. Acts chapter 7. We learn things in his sermon and in his understanding and preaching about the Old Testament that we wouldn't know otherwise. And I'll try to point some of those things out, but he gives us key information even that the Old Testament doesn't automatically share for us, that we have to kind of read between the lines to even see it. At that moment, Stephen, I believe, is going to be sharing with the Jews one last time that Jesus is their Messiah and they need to receive him. Will they receive or accept him is the key. And ultimately, as we're nearing 15 minutes and I'm practically done here, tomorrow is going to be a big one. Like I said, Acts chapter 7 is one of the most important passages in all the Bible because it's one of the most important passages in Jewish history and the history of the world. And it affects us as Christians, as Gentile Christians, as non-Jew Christians right now. It affects us big time because it was a shift from how God was working with the Jews to then how God was going to work with literally everybody else. And not to say that he doesn't work with Jews at all today, but there's a definite shift that takes place after Acts chapter 7. And so I go back to this point that I kind of said at the beginning. Why is that important? What's the application here? Because Steve is not an apostle. One of the most critical moments in history, God used a regular old dude who was feeding some widows, was part of the food program of the church, and yet he was still filled with the Holy Spirit and bold in sharing the gospel. It was who he was. It wasn't his job per se. It was just who he was as a person. And God used Stephen, a normal, typical, average Joe, just like you and I. So the application obviously is, I hope, very clear to you, that if he can use Stephen, he can use you and I. That there isn't this weird hierarchy structure where it's like, okay, here's Jesus and he teaches the 12 disciples and somehow they're above everybody else. The problem with that is once they're all gone, then now what? The power isn't with isn't with those people. It's with the Holy Spirit. The power is with the Holy Spirit that indwells the individuals that follow Jesus. That's where the true power or wisdom or whatever comes from. That's where the work will come. It's not from Peter and John and Matthew. What it did work through, God did work through them because of the Holy Spirit indwelling them. But he also worked through Stephen. Eventually will work through Paul, work through other individuals, and has worked through people for almost 2,000 years, 1,980 some odd years since this moment. That includes you and me. True power, true wisdom from God comes through the Holy Spirit who indwells us after we place our faith and trust in Jesus. So, trust in the Holy Spirit, walk in the Holy Spirit, live by the Spirit, as Galatians chapter 5 says. And I'm going to say some pretty amazing things are going to happen to you, and you're going to see God work in amazing ways. With that, please share a prayer request if you have any. Sunday church is happening, 8 o'clock, 10 o'clock. Please come if you want. There are some restrictions, I guess, about seating and that kind of thing, but ultimately we want people to come to church. So if you are willing and wanting, please show up. I'll be here tomorrow at noon for our Friday Devo, end of the week Devo about Stephen and what happens to him. But otherwise, until then, you guys have a classy day, and I will see you tomorrow.